Hello, my name is David Ades. I'm a poet based in Sydney and the host of a monthly poetry reading series called Poets Corner in association with WestWords in Parramatta in Sydney's West. WestWords is Western Sydney's literature development organisation. Poets Corner is part of WestWords' public programming that celebrates the richness, diversity and insight that literature offers. Especially in these times, we thank the ongoing support of Create New South Wales, the Cultural Fund of Copyright Australia, City of Parramatta Council, Blacktown City Council and Campbelltown City Council, as well as the many project partners that have enabled us to continue to provide opportunities to writers and audiences. We hope that this new world will see a sharing and a closeness of spirit. So as everyone who's seen this knows already, each month I invite a poet to read poems and talk about them for an hour or so around a theme of the poet's choice. Our guest poet today is Maria Takolander, who will read poems and talk on the theme of transforming pain through poetry. But first, an acknowledgement of country. I'm recording this from Beecroft in Sydney. Maria is recording from Geelong in Victoria. I'd like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, of the Wallamita people, the traditional custodians of the land in Beecroft, and of the Wadawurrung people, the traditional custodians of the land in Geelong, and to acknowledge also that they are the sovereign owners of their land, which has never been ceded or given up. Maria Takolander is a Finnish-Australian poet, fiction writer, essayist and independent scholar. She is the author of 4 books of poetry: Trigger Warning, University of Queensland Press 2021, which won a Victorian Premier's Literary Award; The End of the World, Giramondo 2014, named a Best Book of the Year in Australian Book Review and reviewed in the Los Angeles Review of Books; Ghostly Subjects, Salt 2009, shortlisted for a Queensland Premier's Literary Award; and the chapbook Narcissism, Whitmore Press 2005. Her poems were selected for the Best Australian Poems and/or the Best Australian Poetry every year from 2005 until those anthologies ceased publication, and are represented in Motherlode, Australian Women's Poetry 1986 to 2008, which was published in 2009, 30 Australian Poets 2011, the Turnrow Anthology of Contemporary Australian Poetry 2014, Contemporary Australian Poetry 2016, Me Too, Stories from the Australian Movement 2019, the Anthology of Australian Prose Poetry 2020, What We Carry, Poetry on Childbearing 2021, Homings and Departures, Selected Poems from Contemporary China and Australia 2021, and Fishing for Lightning, The Spark of Poetry 2021. Her poems have also been published internationally. Radio National aired a program about her poetry in 2015, and she has performed her poetry on TV and at the 2017 International Poetry Festival of Medellín, Colombia. Maria is also a prize-winning fiction writer and the author of The Double and Other Stories, Text 2013, shortlisted for a Melbourne Prize for Literature. Her website is mariatakolander.com. Hi, Maria, finally, after all that, and welcome to Poets Corner.
Hi, David, and thanks for having me on the show.
So you're reading poems today from your latest book, Trigger Warning, and I'm always interested in process. So I want to ask you first whether you wrote the poems in this book around a pre-existing concept, or whether you wrote the poems without a particular concept in mind and then found that they coalesced to fit the concept.
Yeah, well, I started with the poems in the first section of the book. And in fact, I was triggered to write those poems because
there you go.
My husband had a health event. He had a heart attack, which ended up with him having bypass surgery. And he was quite young for this to have happened to him. And it was quite a difficult time. And, you know, I found myself experience a kind of level of precariousness or uncertainty and fear that reminded me very viscerally of the kind of uncertainty and fear that I had felt as a child growing up in a home with domestic violence. So it was a genuinely triggering experience in terms of transporting me back through time to that sense of feeling quite at a loss. And in the aftermath of that experience, I thought that it was quite interesting And I wanted to explore it further through these poems. And, I think that poetry can also provide a way of managing difficult experiences and feelings. And so I'm sure that there was something therapeutic about that process of, working through that experience at the level of play and transformation, where the task just became about ordering the words on a page, refining an image, and in a way that provided a kind of distancing from the trauma of that experience. And so that's, basically where the book started. Then the poems in the second part of the book, a lot of them were actually written during lockdown. And the poems in the second part of the book try to address domestic objects with a kind of playful view. And, during lockdown, as we all know, a poet was deprived of source material and inspiration to a certain extent, So I'm an opportunist. And, I was spent a lot of time, as we all did, looking at the familiar things in our homes and looking at them with the eye of the poet, which is a defamiliarizing eye. I also found that this could work to re-envision the objects of the domestic space that were haunted for me in a way by my childhood, during which, a time in which, domestic objects were often broken. The television was often smashed, pot plants were often overturned, light fittings ripped from the ceiling. So, the home has always been, in a sense, haunted by that history for me. But, these poems are not about that trauma so much as about moving beyond that to something more playful, I think. And as I said, we're definitely opportunistic in terms of being, in terms of happening during that lockdown period.
It was very interesting to me to see how many different ways poets found to use that opportunity in their writing during lockdown, and so many different manifestations of it. It hadn't occurred to me to do that, and reading those poems was a bit of a revelation. That's a very, very smart thing to do. How does the book relate to your theme of transforming pain through poetry?
So I mean, as I was saying, I think in that first part of the book where the poems are called confessions, confessions are always a kind of game of hide and seek. And, in as much as you still wear a disguise, even as you're performing revelation, they're never as simple, I think, as they seem. But the question was about transformation, wasn't it? So as I was saying, I think that the ability to play with the material that poetry and literature provides enables a kind of transformation or a movement away from the trauma, even as you're supposedly addressing the trauma. So I think that's a really interesting dynamic for me. The poems in the second part of the book are definitely about moving away from that sense of the domestic as a haunted space to something, again, more transformative and playful, using that age-old trick of the poet, defamiliarization. I don't think I invented anything new there. And then the poems in that third section of the book, which are elegiac and often address climate change. Is there any escape from trauma or pain? Going into the Anthropocene, I think we've got more hardship in store for everyone. So
I was wondering whether or not, having written the book, you now feel completely differently in a way, having been transformed by the process of writing it, whether you feel differently about the subject matter in the book having finished it.
Look, I don't think writing poetry is a substitute for therapy.
No.
And I did my time. I did 10 years of cognitive behavioural therapy to address some of the damage, some of the legacy that one has after growing up in a violent, volatile home. But and in fact, I think that the playfulness that I have vis-a-vis that past as material is something only enabled by the therapeutic intervention, because otherwise I would be mired in the trauma still. So, you can, I think, only perform that history in the way that I attempt to do in the confessional poems, because I have a certain distance from it. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's just sounding like this stuff has been worked through before you put pen to paper, in a sense, and then putting pen to paper is moving on from that and doing something with what you've worked through. Is that right? Is that?
Yeah, I think so. It's being able to treat it as material rather than being overwhelmed by it. But I was thinking actually about my first full-length collection, Ghostly Subjects. That speaks in this really oblique way to my childhood trauma, but it wasn't something that I had come out about in those days. And the poetry as a result is very different. Whereas in Trigger Warning, I think the poetry is very lucid, because it's less the case that I have something to hide. And to put all of that into context, the children of domestic violence are often brought up in a kind of pact of silence. So it's a familial pact of silence. It's about loyalty to the family secret, and, then you have society also telling you to keep quiet about it because you're not hearing these stories in the public sphere. So you grow up very much trapped in the silence, which is something that exacerbates the trauma. Trauma thrives in silence.
Yeah.
The enemy of trauma is conversation, is discourse, is talking about it, talking through it. So, I think that this book speaks to that recovery on the personal front anyway, in just the mere fact of its lucidity, and I hope playfulness, because I hope, even though those confessional poems do deal with dark subject matter, I hope that there's still some levity there, because I like to laugh as much as the next person.
Excuse me, where would we be without laughter?
Oh, I know, goodness me, yeah.
So is writing poetry a kind of archaeological exercise for you?
I actually try to avoid my history as much as possible. I'm not interested in living in the past. I self-consciously try and live in the present moment, looking to the future. But for the purposes of those confessional poems, I certainly did revisit the past, and in that sense, it was an archaeological exercise. Just because, as I said, that experience of being triggered, and this idea of being triggered is such a popular idea in our culture at the moment, but this experience predates the popularity of the idea of being triggered. But it was, really interesting to me that I could be catapulted back into that history so powerfully by something happening in the present, and so unconsciously. And I think, nowadays everyone's triggered by everything. We have this kind of really loose use of the term, and it's often used in a way to deflect the conversation from something that's difficult. But domestic violence is something that we need to be talking about out in the open, if it's ever going to be addressed, and if the people who are its victims are ever going to feel heard, and if the perpetrators are ever going to be able to seek treatment. We need to bring this whole subject out into the open.
Yeah, and I think you can't get away from the fact that the past informs the present. So as much as you might want to leave it in the past, it's there, and it's shaped who you've become. So it's not necessarily an indulgence to go back there from time to time, but yes, I like the forward-looking approach too. Yeah. All right. Well, how about we hear a poem?
Okay. Well, I probably should start at the beginning with one of the confessional poems. So a lot of these confessional poems in the first part of the book borrow their titles from the titles of well-known poems by the confessional poets. And this is one of those. It's called Waking in the Blue, and it's addressed to Robert Lau, the poet responsible for the original poem Waking in the Blue, which addresses his institutionalization after a breakdown. My poem is about my institutionalization, can we call it that, in the aftermath of a breakdown on my father's behalf, when my mother and my sister and myself were, we sought refuge in a domestic violence refuge. Waking in the Blue. The night attendant at the service station, which was garishly lit when I had thought the world extinguished, pumps $10 of fuel into our tank. My plastic money box looks childish on the car's back seat, but the silver coins that spill from its plug hole perform an unexpected magic. My mother has nothing, and I see how much it matters. She parks the Toyota on the side of the highway beneath some gums, the white trunks streaked by the comets of passing cars. My sister and I have my favourite blanket gilded with synthetic stars. At break of day, we enter the police station in our dressing gowns. Two faceless men escort us home, where gravity has finally pulled everything down. On the carpet are light fittings, the TV's vacant box, the top half of the laminated wall unit, drawers and their contents, folded maps, loose photographs, volumes of an encyclopedia with their hardcovers torn off. A more comprehensive list isn't necessary. In truth, my room is not as damaged as I want it to be. My sister's has been carefully destroyed. My father is discovered in his bed, as eccentric and confused as one of your old timers. But the police know to stay, while my mother sorts through the debris for a bank book and some clothes, and then the men in blue lead us away. There is a brick house with bars on every window, a room stuffed with bunks and a cumbersome wardrobe. At the kitchen table, women stub cigarette after cigarette into a tin ashtray, playing show and tell with scars, picking over the ruins. My sister has faith in a new miracle of creation, but I am a child, not a visionary, and our mother has already surrendered to the diabolical romance of return. My father, cleanly shaven, stands at the door. Inside, Earth's furious pull has gentled again, allowing the furniture, what was left of it, to right itself. The place looks enough like our home, and our father's naked face enough like contrition. We restore our toothbrushes to the bathroom shelf, where our father's glistening razor rests.
I can see why you don't particularly want to go back there. It's very confronting. It's a very confronting poem. And you have to enter into that moment in order to write it. So it must be hard. As a child, you have no control over events like those described in this poem. There must be a huge sense of confusion and helplessness that, carries on into your life, far beyond childhood. Is writing about this so many years after it occurred an attempt to lay ghosts to rest, or is it serving some other purpose for you?
I think so. It wasn't a fun poem to write by any means, and returning to that experience wasn't one that I enjoy. But, there is, as I think I suggested earlier, a certain distancing that comes from playing with that experience as material and crafting it into a poem. And, that's kind of a defense, I suppose, that enables me to revisit that experience. but is it important for me to revisit it, and why? And I think it is because, you know, up until this book came out, I had maintained the silence of loyalty that children are encouraged to have when it comes to these experiences. And that silence wasn't serving me very well at all. In fact, you know, if I was triggered by my husband's health event, I think it was because I hadn't been open enough to talking about all of this stuff. And I can tell you that when the book was coming out with UQP, I had a panic attack. I wanted to call them and tell them to pulp all the copies and delete the file.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. I was like,
I didn't want it to come out. But because it came out and I had to do, you know, media and stuff around it, I was forced to talk about this stuff publicly. And, you know, it was a kind of reckoning for me. And I came to see that this experience isn't a personal one. I mean, people read this collection, I think, oh my goodness, it's deeply personal. How could she have spoken about this stuff? But, you know, domestic violence is a public issue. It's a social problem. And we need to move away from this perception that, you know, there are these individual families out there suffering alone, and that's the way it should be. It just can't go on like that. We need to be able to talk about it publicly. So, I mean, that if there is an agenda behind revisiting that stuff, it is in part personal, because I need to be able to talk about this stuff so the trauma doesn't have that grip. But also it's in part political, because we need to recognise that this is a social problem and we need to be able to talk about it.
Well, what struck me about the poem was that it's neither blaming or judgmental, which it so easily could have been. Was it hard to suspend judgment or blame?
No. And this is why I think it's important for the children of domestic violence to have a say in the public discourse about domestic violence, because we have very complex feelings towards the perpetrators, who are so often our fathers. You know, there is still love, there is still loyalty. There are some times of fun, of joy, of closeness that are all bound up in our childhood experience. So, no, I don't feel a great sense of recrimination or anger. And, you know, my feelings are far more complex. And I also recognise that my father himself was a victim, and it's well known that, you know, domestic violence is cyclical. It repeats. Victims of domestic violence become perpetrators of domestic violence. I actually have no idea about my father's childhood. He was never forthcoming about anything to do with his history, but there's clearly damage there. You know, for a person to do what he did to himself, but also to his family members, there's clearly deep damage and pain. And, you know, I don't think it helps to demonize perpetrators. I think it would be more useful to pathologize perpetrators, because then we can help them recover from what would be a pretty miserable life for themselves as much as for their families.
I think it's hard to find compassion for them, but actually that's what they need, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. And intervention. They do need help, because, I mean, the response, you know, is often still to move the women and children away from the perpetrator into the domestic violence refuge, which my poem addresses. But it's no solution, because even if that family leaves that perpetrator often picks up with a new partner and the abuse continues. So the only way to stop it is, in fact, to intervene at the level of the perpetrator. And recent research has shown that, in particular, perpetrators are responsive to treatment when they hear about the impact that their behaviour has on their children. So that's often when a breakthrough can be made, because, you know, relations or, you know, dynamics between men and women can be complicated and can be perceived as complicated, more complicated than they probably are by the male perpetrators, who often blame the women for their actions. But children, you know, it's easy to see children as blameless. And I think that's why talking about the impact that domestic violence has on children is so often effective. in terms of prompting men to change their behaviour.
You use a very concise phrase in the poem that seems to me to have a lot behind it. I was just wondering if you could expand on your phrase, the diabolical romance of return.
Return is always diabolical, I think. No one wants to return to the past. For instance, I don't want to return to the past. So it feels diabolical, but also, they're within the context of domestic violence. Again, there is the problem of women often returning to the scene of the crime and that trauma being perpetuated. I think it's really difficult to break with a habit, to break with the past, to forge a new future. I think that moment of leaving can always easily lapse into a moment of return, because it is so difficult to break with the past and to make that move into an unknown future.
Especially if there's financial issues involved and you don't have that autonomy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that was certainly the case with my family. We're migrants, didn't have a great connection with any particular community. Language skills weren't great. So economic considerations were also at the foreground.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned before that the poems in this section of the book are addressed, and take the title of a poem from another poet. What inspired that approach to the poems?
The difficulty of talking about this subject matter. I didn't know how to do it. But I remembered, when I first read the confessional poets as a high school student, we didn't have books in our home. So my exposure to literature happened at public school. Thank goodness for public schools. Long may the government continue to fund them and fund them properly. But, I remember reading the confessional poets for the first time and being stunned that they were talking about these issues, because I hadn't seen anyone speak about, mental illness or write about mental illness or, the kind of intense things that can happen in relationships. So that was a real watershed moment for me and for everyone in the 50s and 60s. It was a hugely radical act for these poets to be writing about such intensely personal subject matter. But, I think they paved the way for the kinds of conversations that we're able to have today about mental illness and relationship problems. Certainly writing back to those poems was a way for me to break my silence and address these issues.
Mm. All right, you've got another one for us.
I do. This poem is titled after Sylvia Plath's poem Daddy. How could I not go there?
Exactly.
And addressed to her. If Plath got stuck in her trauma and mental illness, I was fortunate to be able to move on. And I think this poem is in part about that. Daddy, addressed to Sylvia Plath. Like you, I suffered from narcissism and made myself up for disaster as if for a masquerade ball. It all started with my father too, a man fraught with the night and the truth of its unquiet. His routine was magnetizing. He would chain himself to the table and pour malice down his gullet until he and the night were one, until he was like a Dionysian god, eyes barren of shine. Once my mother bought him a telescope as a birthday gift, but he had no interest in observing the vestigial glitter of anything. The instrument stayed in its felt box. He rarely opened presents. My father never celebrated the past or future. He knew only what he had always known, that night would come, rotting in the corner of his eye, not giving a damn who was watching. As he saw it, he had no choice but to join in. Each night brought another vile morning. My father had no tenderness for daylight, nor his two daughters, which I, little egotist, tasked myself to imitate. By the time I was a teenager, I was his nocturnal godling, cut from the flesh of his groin, spilling myself like waste. Now, though, I am an unlikely 40-year-old in a lecture theatre, no longer playing him, but you, courtesy of the BBC, declaiming daddy, of course. You are vengeful and stone cold as a Valkyrie. Death has deemed your act divine. I am merely alive, teaching Ariel to a darkened room of youth loyal to the glow of their screens. They have written off the 60s and all its would-be intercessors, like me, smuggling confessional poetry through the decades as if gripped by the throat. I am standing at the podium, ready for the finale. You bastard, I'm through. There is no thunder of applause, and yet I thrill, secret murderess of history.
Yeah, I can see obviously the connections with Sylvia Plath. How important is Sylvia Plath's poetry to your oeuvre?
Sylvia Plath's a huge influence on me, as on so many other women poets over the decades, because of the ways in which she gives permission to talk about, intense emotional states and troubled times, shall we say. So, and she has a certain clarity of image that I admire, but, I think she was famously stuck in her psychic trauma. She was never able to, ultimately move beyond that. It would have been interesting to see what kind of poetry she had written if she was able to grow older and move into a future. But yeah, she's a huge influence.
You speak of smuggling confessional poetry through the decades as if gripped by the throat. I was interested in the violence to that image. Can you elaborate on that idea?
Yes. Well, I do feel a certain compulsion to talk about this subject matter. Trauma can have a grip on you so that there's not always a sense of choice when it comes to what you write about. As for the violence, I think that there are a lot of idealistic visions of creativity, which is all about good health and inviting compassion and empathy from readers who will become better people from reading literature. I find all of that quite dubious, and in part because I think that as writers, if we want to have an impact on the reader, well, that's implicitly a kind of violent or aggressive wish, isn't it, or drive, that we want to affect or impact our reader in a way perhaps that we were impacted by a particular event. And particularly especially when I'm writing about a traumatic event and I force that on a reader because I want them to some degree to experience the trauma of that. I can't pretend that that isn't a violent act at its core.
Your poetry, as exemplified in this poem, is confessional, but not in a maudlin or sentimental way, far from it. It is more of an uncompromisingly direct gaze in which you are quite tough on yourself. There's a vulnerability attached to that. How difficult is it for you to confront and reveal pain through your poems, even with the distancing?
Well, it's not fun, but in the first instance, as you would know, as a poet, you're writing in a very quiet and safe space with no readership.
Yes.
So that makes it easier because you are just confessing to the page. But look, I think there is a performative element to each confession, and I remember the change that occurred in my perception of the poem Daddy from the time I was a teenager to hearing the poem performed in my 40s. So I remember reading it as a teenager and being struck by the possibility that I was receiving some kind of an insight into Sylvia Plath's inner self. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is like almost voyeuristic, and really got into it at that level. But hearing her in my 40s read Daddy on the BBC, I don't know if you've heard the performance, but it's actually quite camp. You know, she's really performing it and playing it up, the melodrama of it, the playfulness of it, you know, with those childlike rhymes and the references to the old lady who lived in the shoe. And there's also those now considered outrageous comparisons between herself and Jews. But, you know, it's very much a melodramatic performance. And it's something that I attempt to emulate, I guess, in my poem.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask you about sort of publicly reading these poems and how that's been received, how you felt doing. Excuse me. How you felt doing it publicly, reading it publicly, and how it's been received publicly.
I haven't read the confessional poems much publicly. So this is one of the rare occasions that I have done so, because I do find it uncomfortable. I don't know if that's come across in my reading. Hopefully I've been able to hide it. But I have actually preferred to read poems from the second section where the poems are more fun. And there's no cost to me to read those poems in the way that there is with the confessional ones.
All right, well, let's go to the fun second section.
Yay! Fun poems. Not something that's often said of poetry, which I think is a shame. I think sometimes we take poetry too seriously.
It's hard to, I find it hard. There's some comic poets about, but I find it hard to write in a comic vein.
Yes, yeah. It's not easy ever, I think, to write in a comic vein. I think it takes a lot of skill, not saying that I have that skill, but I'm attempting. But, you know, I think that the skill required to write comically is often underrated. And, you know, I used to work in a university until last year, and, you know, comic writing was not given much attention. It's not taken seriously by scholars and critics. And I think that's a real shame, but perhaps suggests something about an insecurity, perhaps, when it comes to the category of literature and our need to, you know, prop it up by emphasising its serious qualities when, you know, literature can be entertaining. Why can't we embrace literature and poetry as things that entertain? But, of course, the performance poets know this. And what do you know? They have an audience. All right, so I'll stop being polemical, provocative, and get on with this reading. So this is from the second section of the book where I re-envision domestic objects. And this poem is called Cuckoo Clock, and it is about a clock that still hangs on the wall in my parents' house. It emerged from the Black Forest, encrusted with pagan rumours and fairy tales, and dragged itself here, half a world away, before hanging its fortunes on this living room wall. Its pendulum preserves the momentum of all those hard-won miles. Gloomy like the woodpile, it has an unspoken kinship with the hearth-fire, the kind storybook creatures have. There is no doubt it is intelligent, hiding something, just as the head of an owl camouflaged in the bark of a tree hides its baroque contemplations. Children gather around, as they do, hoping for something. It busies itself manufacturing, dutifully extruding a half-formed baby bird, materially not its own. There is a cry of sorts. Then the creature is removed, a polite but clumsy afterthought. If truth be told, our desires strike it as madness. It is waiting only for time, finally, to stop.
So you're sitting at home, it's locked down, there's a cuckoo clock, you're looking at the cuckoo clock, and you think, I can do something with this.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. Right. Starved of material, one just looks around the immediate environment, and you know the Russian formalists from the early 20th century, and Victor Shklovsky in particular, formulated this idea of poetry as defamiliarizing, and that you could overcome what they called the automatism of perception by looking at things in a poetic way. So, you know, the everyday things that we live with become kind of invisible to us.
Yeah, you don't see them.
We're so accustomed to, seeing them. But, you know, I think that you can generate some magic through poetic defamiliarization when it comes to really anything, just by looking at things as if they are foreign objects. So
how did you do it? You sit there, cuckoo clock's in front of you. Are you kind of like mentally interrogating it? Is there a forensic process at work? What's happening? Or did you not need to have it before in order to conjure its subterranean life? It just came welling up.
No, it's definitely work. When I was young and living at my family home, I often used to dissociate. I often used to lose myself in story worlds of my own making. And, you know, that can be viewed as a pathology, but it's also proven quite useful.
Yeah, it's a defense.
For someone who's, come to be a writer. And one of the games I remember I used to play was that I would pretend to be an alien, I kid you not, and who had just appeared in the home, and then I would look at everything as if I didn't know what these things were. So in fact, I channeled that particular game that I used to play as a child. But, you know, with the knowledge that I have now of the strategy of defamiliarization as a very productive poetic technique. So I brought those two things together.
Well, I love the ascribing of intelligence to the clock. It gives it a whole new meaning to the in the poem. It's infused with a kind of unsettling fairy tale gloom and menace, isn't it? I was wondering whether you're suggesting that beneath the surface of things that are all around us and that we perhaps don't see fully, course dark currents, and that we should be paying attention to what lies beneath.
Yeah, well, I think I am attentive, perhaps overly attentive, to the possibility of dark currents coursing beneath the surface of everyday life. And, you know, while I attempted in those poems to escape a kind of domestic haunting that has arisen because of my childhood, I don't know that I ultimately do escape that. And it goes back to what you said earlier, that it is very difficult to leave your past behind, no matter how much you might like to.
Do you want to read us another one?
I would love to. This one is called Telephone, and it takes a kind of historical view of that object, but in a way that I think already acknowledges the intimate and perhaps almost masochistic relationship that we have with the mobile. Telephone. It could shatter darkness, set us bolt upright and panicking through the broken night to show our devotion. Then, as we stood barefoot and barely clothed, it would think nothing of abandoning us to the cold physics of a dial tone, the toxic chemistry of our hearts. No, it wasn't always good to us. Never warned when tragedy was on the offensive, never protected us from cold calls or perverts with an excess of breath. Still, it was everything. We would have been so alone without it. We wrote love songs and made all those films in the throes of our technophilia, flexing taut curls through our fingers. Looking back, the romance seems so old-fashioned, so unsubtle. How can we not feel embarrassed? Of course, we were young then. Look at us now, free of brutalist bakelite and wire, revolutionary in our intimacy. Goodness, we barely have to speak. Our future is a sure thing. In bed we glow, radioactive for each other.
Are you nostalgic, do you think, Maria, for the good old days before mobile phones, when you had to laboriously dial each number?
I'm not easily given to nostalgia because the past for me isn't a space of particular warmth or fuzzy feeling. But, you know, how can we not get nostalgic about the history of objects, and certainly the phone? I remember, you know, even, you know, watching, you know, older films now, and by older I mean perhaps the 80s and 90s, and you see those old phones with the, you know, the curling cord and, yeah, the dial. Oh, yeah, it's good stuff.
I've got 3 kids. The oldest is 15. She's glued to her phone. But it's a completely different kind of relationship to the relationships that, you know, older people like me had with phones back in the day. And as much as it gives us, it sort of takes away too, I think, this evolution of the phone. It's become so ubiquitous. But do you think it's become a barrier to genuine communication? I mean, is that your line? Goodness, we barely have to speak. Almost a commentary on the fact that, you know, we have the blessing of technology, but it's a curse at the same time.
Oh, for sure. And I can definitely relate. I have a 13-year-old son, and, you know, there's the nightly battle to getting him off his phone and joining his family in some, you know, communal familial activity or something. So, you know, I think, you know, it's an interesting development. My niece, who's 19, you know, views her phone as her connection with her peers, and yet, as you know, the older generation, we view it as an obstacle to their connection with us. It's kind of the but, you know, like thinking back to the good old fashioned telephone, I remember spending a fair bit of time on that as a teenager, talking to friends after school, even though I'd seen them all day there. So I don't know if, you know, that much has changed in terms of our dependence. But I have always found it peculiar, actually, that when a phone rings, someone always runs to answer it, even though the ringing phone is an imposition in your private space. Why do we have to obey the command of a ringing phone to answer? So I think that kind of revelation, or whatever it was, did inform that poem.
Now you're going to read a couple of other poems that are from the next section of the book, where you use images in the poems. I'm very glad that we can actually, when we publish the podcast, we can actually have the poems on one side of the screen as you're reading them, so that people can see their visual aspect. I'd love to know the genesis of that visual component to the poems.
Yeah. So I've never really written nature poetry, and perhaps in part because there's such a long and strong tradition that I didn't feel I could really offer anything new. But then it struck me that in the age of the Anthropocene, nature itself has been defamiliarized. So nature poetry also needs to change to reflect the changing environment. And I was actually commissioned to be part of a project writing poetry about plants at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Melbourne. And so this was the impetus for me to try my hand at writing nature poetry, which I had never done. And I chose to write about an area of the Royal Botanic Gardens in Melbourne known as Guilfoyle's Volcano. And it's an area planted with succulents and other drought-tolerant, prickly kinds of plants that rarely inspire the kinds of odes that roses perhaps do. So I thought that would be an interesting challenge. And it also spoke to a certain sense that I had, that we would have to change our aesthetic appreciation of flora with the changing climate, which will see more resilient and tough plants survive and thrive. So we needed to perhaps start celebrating those underrepresented and undervalued forms of plant life. So, I wrote a series of haiku about, cactuses and all sorts of things, which is, me being a little bit of a smart ass, I suppose, because, the haiku form isn't traditionally given to writing about those kinds of nature scenarios. And that led me to then start experimenting formally with other ways of representing nature.
Including the visual.
Yes, absolutely. So in, I think the poem that I'm going to read, which is called, it's a sequence of poems called Scenes from a Documentary. Each of the poems is about a particular creature. So a polar bear, which is an obvious one because polar bears are often used as a kind of symbol representing the decline of traditional environments and the challenges that poses to wildlife. So I did want to represent polar bear, but I didn't want to do it in a way that suggested that nothing had changed. How do we write nature poetry now that nature has changed? That whole idea of the natural has been so impacted by human actions. Should I read it?
Yes.
Okay, so the first poem from Scenes from a Documentary, and it's called Ursus maritimus, Polar Bear. A clash of icebergs strewn on the frozen shore. The wind and the wandering animal are dreamed by the blinding drifts of snow. She haunts the fault lines where currents fracture pack ice, where gluts of seals gush up and slap the cold like mud. She claws a hole in the permafrost and entombs herself. Inside the fevered den, she turns like a trapped compulsive, tends her newborn cub like a wound.
Yeah, so I was wondering whether you were going to try and sort of in some way speak the images, but you don't. You speak the words around the images, and the images just speak for themselves.
Yeah, it's definitely a poem for the page, but there are these unspeakable elements, aren't there? When we try to represent another life form, we don't have access to the reality of their experience. So I suppose that's something I'm trying to suggest, but also, that they live in a material environment that we have destroyed or are close to destroying. And so I wanted to represent the creature kind of moving within that environment, which I attempted to symbolize in some way. It was an experiment.
Mm. Yeah, well, I related to it on a number of levels. I've seen a bear in a zoo in Southeast Asia compulsively walking back and forth in a, palpably obvious response to the trauma of captivity. And it was quite distressing to see. I hope I never see it again. We know that the habitats of polar bears are shrinking, disappearing. Is this poem suggesting that even in the wild, bears sense that they are in captivity?
That line, that's kind of interesting. Well, I did intend to suggest, I guess, that their domain is shrinking, but I tied that with an image of a polar bear about to give birth. And in that time, they do bury themselves in a kind of igloo-like structure. Mm. And I think through discomfort, move around in that space, very confined space. But I'm sure from personal experience of giving birth that movement also helps with the whole process as much as it provides relief from pain. So, I'm glad that came across because it is about the shrinking of their domain, but also of that moment of giving birth.
Mm. There is a sense for me now, as I imagine there is for many people, and it terrifies me that watching nature documentaries like those of David Attenborough is almost archival, that they are documenting things that are leaving from the world. So there is actually an enormous pain in watching documentaries, in seeing such rich beauty and understanding that that's being lost. Is that part of what this poem is referencing?
Oh, you're absolutely right. It's almost unbearable to watch nature documentaries now, I think, because increasingly they do have to acknowledge that so many of the species they feature are under threat. And the repetitiveness of that scenario, I think, when you watch a nature documentary is almost overwhelming in its painfulness and because of our helplessness, it seems, to do anything about it. So yeah, this documentary sequence is definitely inspired by exactly that kind of an experience that you've described, David.
Mm. And you have one more poem for us.
Ah, yes. So this is a poem from another sequence called Fractured States of America, and each poem in this sequence is inspired by a news story of a bizarre happening from the United States. And this one is based on a news report of a man in Florida disappearing into a sinkhole. And it uses pie charts and other graphs to illustrate our reckoning with the planet, which is done so often via an economic or business or accounting discourse.
Yes.
And the absurdity of that whole situation, there's such a profound mismatch between the environment and then the kinds of things we attempt to overlay on it in terms of our values and priorities, which are so often economic. Anyway, it's called Sinkhole Alley, and it goes like this. Frank was sleeping in Tampa, Florida, when the land disappeared, abducting him and his second-hand bed. Emergency services quickened to the alien pit rimmed with torn ground slab concrete, ragged fibro and hairy plaster bits. The hole was deep. They lowered in a listening device, but not one word came from down below. A piece of me, Frank's brother told the Tampa Bay Times, is gone. Engineers poured in low slump aggregate grout. A freelancer released a camera drone and authorities roped off the scene. The insurance company, robbed even of breath by such collapses of the firmament, had nothing left to give. The situation had become so unbalanced. Earth itself was now more of a threat than terrorists. It obeyed no code of ethics. It even stole from the retired, leaving funereal holes in their manicured lawns. In the trailer park, a young mother of 6 said the disappearing reminded her of giving birth, only in reverse. The world is reeling. Who would have thought Mother Nature could do this to us?
So you got me Googling this event to find out a little bit about it after I read the poem. You changed the name of the victim, I think.
I did.
There you go. I mean, I know poets who trawl the news really for inspiration for their poems. So is that something that you do, or is this just that you had an idea here and you wanted to pursue the idea through those bizarre events?
Yeah, it was really a happenstance that I came across those 3 stories. One's about trying to capture icebergs that are posing a threat in shipping lanes. And another one is about a woman who was hit by a piece of falling space debris. And I came across those 3 stories at different times, but noted them. I have a note function on my phone that I use whenever I come across something interesting and potentially useful as material. And, you know, at a later point, I realized that those three stories could come together in this kind of absurd sequence of poems addressing how bizarre it is to live in modernity, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, I've noticed this. I mean, how can you not? Death is something that's always waiting for us, but it can be very creative in the way it finds us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, and I laugh. I mean, you know, there is some absurdity involved in these bizarre ways of meeting death that I think, you know, helps us deal with it, I suppose. I hope that I'm not being too flippant. And if I did change the name of the character into Frank, it was because I was aware that perhaps to his family reading a poem like that, if they happen to ever come across it, would seem a little unsensitive.
Yeah. So we like to comfort ourselves with routines in the illusion that they protect us somehow from the random chaos that underlies our existence. And these poems go to that chaos. But we go to bed at night in the expectation that we'll wake up in the morning, unless, you know, we die in our sleep or something. But as you put it, Earth obeys no code of ethics. No, why should it? You know, we know this, but shocking events like this bring it home to us powerfully. Is this poem trying to say more than that?
I think if it said that, David, I'd be quite happy. So there you go. I'm pleased that you got that out of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you sit with a poem, and that's why I like to get the poems in advance of these podcasts, so I can sit with it for a little bit and let it speak to me. Some speak to me more clearly than others, of course. And you, sorry, I was wrong. You have another poem for us.
Yes, I do. We did, come up with in fact, the final poem in the collection, which is kind of a self-reflexive poem to end the collection, because it addresses my obsession, our obsession with trauma and pain as a source or subject of poetry, and the difficulty of writing about its opposite, that elusive experience we call happiness. What is it? How do we capture it? You know, I think that there are very few poems that address that subject, although there are certainly works of literature that inspire happiness, and they're often comic ones. But yeah, what is happiness? How do we write about it? That's the subject of this prose poem, which is called Unhappiness. History recognises Turun Sol as a standard disappointment in the ancient practice of poetry, now rare, solitary word game played by the melancholy and narcissistic. While Sol's name has become synonymous with an excessive form of morbid verse, it should be noted, if the translations of Sol's soot-stained diaries are to be trusted, that the poet's quest may have originally been optimistic. One must keep in mind that Sol's goal was never to describe mirth or excitement, which are merely temporary conditions easily tainted by inebriation or schadenfreude. The object of the poet's mission was more stable and pure, yet evidence of it was so ambiguous. Like pain, it was hard to credit in others. In fact, there was always the possibility that it did not exist at all. One could contrive its appearance simply by being acquiescent and inactive, as a monk or husband might. In any case, it was important to adopt an attitude of skepticism in order not to appear a sentimental fool. The greatest difficulty posed by Sol's subject, of course, was that it avoided words as if they carried the plague. It protected itself like a blue blood bounded by forest-fed walls of fire. It destroyed images of itself before they could be generated. The ultimate iconoclast, one might say. In the end, Turun Sol is said to have found herself writing obsessively about her subject's manifold and miserable antitheses. such that it seemed she herself wondered if language was invented for the sole purpose of expressing pain.
This poem seems to be written in a way that's quite different from most of the other poems in the book.
Yes.
Not simply about the subject matter, but just the style of the writing.
Yeah, I would agree. I was, aiming to parody a kind of academic discourse. And the poem wasn't written to be the final poem in this collection. The poem was written incidentally along the way at some time. I have no idea when. But it just, it seemed miraculously to fit there, because I hoped that it would, as a final poem, draw out some of the humour in the collection so that it would provide a kind of palate cleanser as a final poem after you'd been through some of the darker material. But I think there's a truth there that, to portray happiness in a poem is highly problematic. If you risk looking smug, you risk putting people offside. I think people are more comfortable with others' challenges, difficulties, suffering than they are perhaps with the prospect of someone being blissfully happy. What does that say about human nature? I'm not sure.
But blissfully happy is a momentary thing. We can write about those momentary things, surely.
Yes. So, maybe happiness is always ephemeral, but, I think that one can achieve a state of contentment, but I'm not sure that it makes for thrilling poetry.
No, well, I once heard a writer say that in order to write, you could not be content. You needed to have some area of conflict. And that was that's the propulsion for good writing. But I went on a little goose hunt for Turin Sol, thinking that this might be a real person. Is it a real person? Because I could not find any reference to Turin Sol anywhere.
No, it's not. I love making up names, and if the name has a provenance, it is in a place in Finland called Turku, which is where a lot of my family live. And if Turku turns into a genitive form, it's Turun. And so without the dots over the O, Sol is Spanish word for sun. Yeah. So I do like playing with languages and words, not surprisingly, as a poet.
So getting down to the nitty-gritty here, do you think that happiness is an illusory human construct? That, to use a line from the poem, there was always the possibility that it did not exist at all?
No, I don't. No, I have known happiness. I, to this day, know contentment despite the challenges that arise in life. So, no, I don't believe that it's an illusion, but it may be, constantly being tested by life's challenges. But, I think it's our job to try and sustain it in the face of difficulty.
So if we go back to your theme of transforming pain through poetry, how is pain transformed through poetry for you?
Through the play of words and images, it becomes material for a game that hopefully gives readers some joy in the way it gives me joy to make it.
Did you have anything else you wanted to say about the theme or this book?
I think I have exhausted everyone's patience as it is, David.
I like to go on. But look, thank you so much, Maria. It's been wonderful to have you on, and your poems and insights on the theme of transforming pain through poetry. A list of Maria's publications will be posted with this podcast. For information on Maria's books, please go to her website at www.mariatakalanda.com. And the link to that website will also be available with this podcast. We will return in June with Steve Evans on the theme of animals. See you then.